Right, good evening everybody and welcome to this ABP Prism nutrition webinar this evening. It's part one of two that James is going to be doing for us. As you'll probably all have realised, you're all muted so that there's no interference on the webinar tonight. But if you do want to ask a question at any point in time, then hopefully you can all see the chat function within the programme. If you just click on that and type your question in. I will ask the questions to James either as we're going through during the presentation. If it's relevant to the part that James is talking about, then I'll ask him at that point, or I'll leave it to the end if I think it's we don't need to ask it as we're going through. But do use that, and anything you're thinking of, please do ask the question, because if you're thinking it, somebody else probably is. There's never such thing as a stupid question. So do ask away, and James is the chap with all the knowledge, so do ask him and try and use his expertise this evening. I'm not going to try and pronounce James's surname. He can say that to you when he starts on, because otherwise I'll just say it wrong. But James is a sheep farmer originally from Northern Ireland, and he lectures at Harper Adams in beef production systems, and his interest involves dairy and beef production, and with a real focus on feed efficiency, protein and trace element nutrition. So as I say, it's one of two, so I think you probably all signed up for next week, but if you haven't, then do let me know and I'll add you to the list. So I think I'll pass over to you, James, and then you can tell them your surname without me getting it wrong, and then yeah, get straight into your presentation.
That's grand, Katie. It's not letting me share.
Ah.
If you could just trigger that for me, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, no, I'll do that. Let me just... You should be able to now.
Awesome, Katie. Thank you. And just to check, it is 40-ish minutes you were after, yeah?
Yeah, that'll be fine.
Yep, that's fine with me. Is that sharing my PowerPoint one, Katie? Yeah, not my emails, yep. I hope. Right, that's fine.
No, I can't see your emails. That is your PowerPoint, so that's great. If you can just, pop it in big.
Right, folks. So my second name is McCachern. I'm Dr. James McCachern, and I've put together a little bit of a presentation on really feeding, a little bit on diet formulation and its effects on carbon, certainly within beef production systems. Katie's done a pretty good introduction for me there. I was a sheep farmer from Northern Ireland. My sister still is. I lecture predominantly in beef production systems here. My primary focus, I would have to say, research-wise, is actually on my primary focus research-wise is actually in disease diagnostics, and in terms of diagnosing things like acidosis in dairy cows and beef cattle as well. But like everything else, I kind of get drawn into carbon the same way most people seem to be nowadays at some point in time. Harper Adams, for those that are unaware, we have a campus of roughly just below 3,000 full-time students. With that comes a working farm. We have about 420 cows, 60 milked through a robot. The rest are pretty intensively managed, it has to be said. We have high genetic merit flock in terms of our sheep. We have about 240 sows. We have the highest performing pig herd in the UK. We also have the beef that I'm about to talk about now, with a little bit of a research focus on poultry and also crop and environment research whenever it comes to crops. So if we just look at our beef enterprise, I mean, we have the same problems as everyone else. We have two beef enterprises here at Harper for two reasons: for research, for teaching, and as a result, we have two quite diverse ones. So this picture on the left, we have a British Blue Cross intensive indoor finishing system, in which we finish from our dairy herd crossbred British Blue heifers and steers, with a target age at slaughter at roughly about 13 to 14 months. Katie, are lots of people coming in? Is that what the bleeping is?
Yeah, they're all coming in, so don't panic about the beeping.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Tandem to that, we have just started an outdoor extensive beef production system as well. We're trying to finish crossbred, dairy cross, Aberdeen Angus steers and heifers. Autumn born, first winter inside, transitioning out into a rotational grazing system. And then through into outwintering crops, and essentially those are remaining outside the whole way through the production system. So we have two quite contrasting production systems. Now, the future farm itself has a target of net zero by 2030. So in terms of some of the greenhouse gas mitigation measures, themes and things I'm about to talk about, a lot of them we are actually trying ourselves in some way, shape or form. So I've just put together the next two topics, folks, are really, today I'm going to focus on diet formulation and how we can try and manage the carbon that actually flows into our animals, or make it more efficient would be the way that I would think of it. And then second, next week, I hope to focus more on the production of feed, growing feed, its utilization, what value is it to us. Suppose the first question I would have, and I wonder if Katie's put these together for me, is whenever somebody says net zero, what is your first reaction to that? I know what mine is, but what is your first reaction to that? Are you able to run those for me, Katie?
Yep, it should be live on the screen for everybody, hopefully. You just yourself that probably won't be able to see it because you're sharing.
Yep, that's okay.
Can everyone see that? Is there some nods that you can see that? Yeah, there's a response, so.
I like the first one.
Hopefully we get some more responses and not just one. Oh, two responses. Here we go. We've got some more. So we've got about 8 responses there, James. I don't know if you can see those.
Yep, I can see those, Katie. They're coming through. Hang on, am I able to move this? No, it's not letting me move it. So we've got
a few others that have actually said, but I don't think they put it on the poll. So another one said no such thing, and someone said, where do we start? Or where to start?
No such thing, where to start. The other one, in terms of the ones online, misunderstanding, work, way, rich. I would agree with quite a bit of that. Inputs and outputs, impossible, change, progression. Right, so yeah, I would actually go with, just before I hit diet formulation and that there sort of stuff, you've got stuff coming through there on where to start, no such thing. And I have to say, I'll just throw that back up again. Certainly, folks, I would agree with you on virtually all that stuff. I mean, what is net zero? If you take it at its very bog standard basics, net zero is whatever carbon is flowing into the system equals the carbon that is essentially flowing out of the system. Now, if you follow the conservation of energy, it cannot be created or destroyed. It just changes from one form to the other. So the very fact of the matter that we are farming something means that we're going to be emitting something. Now, if we think of our greenhouse gases as methane being the big one, nitrous oxides, carbon dioxide, basic theory is that as those are emitted from the human population, and I'm going to say from the human population and not from agriculture, but as those are emitted from the human population, they form a blanket around the Earth, which prevents the loss of UV radiation, and we get this warming effect coming in. So whenever we make that specific to a beef production system, so we just start from, there's lots of things there about where do you start, and my interpretation would be exactly the same as that. as well as the no such thing and everything else that comes in there. I mean, you get in, certainly in literature and media, this concept that cows are killing the planet, in inverted commas. I would probably put inverted commas around that. And the fact of the matter, folks, is that in agriculture, we recycle the majority of our carbon. So we're taking carbon out of the atmosphere in terms of photosynthesis, we cycle it through the system, and we release it. It's only a small quantity of our carbon emissions are actually associated with things like fossil fuels, where we're actually taking the system out of equilibrium. Now, what someone who thinks they are smart will say to that is that we emit a lot of methane. So agriculture actually accounts for quite a large proportion of methane on a global basis. We emit roughly about 2/3 of the methane, which is quite a vicious gas in terms of its warming potential, which is true. But the bit that they fail to acknowledge in that is that the reason that methane is not naturally broken down as it should be is because of carbon monoxide, which comes from the transport industry. Okay, so whenever somebody talks about and says something like the best thing you can do for the planet is stop eating meat, it's absolute nonsense. Our effect on the planet relative to something like the transport industry that is actually causing global warming. So I wouldn't say, I would never be willing to take this thing that agriculture is causing global warming. I will accept, however, that humans are causing global warming. So if somebody presented to me this idea that mitigation of the human carbon footprint by reducing the emissions of agriculture would mitigate against global warming, I'll take that argument, but I won't accept the one that it's red meat consumption per se or agriculture per se that is actually causing global warming. And you get to things like net zero and concepts surrounding net zero. You could easily throw up there biodiversity loss and water pollution as potentially being more important for our industry than necessarily net zero. Okay, but we've got all these things that surround net zero. If we just consider a beef production system, we have our animals. Okay, and whenever we carbon footprint, the first thing that we consider is the feed that goes into those animals. And I'm going to focus on that mostly for the rest of this session. So growing that feed, the fuel to grow that feed is not actually all that much. If you left a loaf of bread in the supermarket, the majority of the carbon that goes into that loaf of bread was actually in the fertilizer. So my colleagues tell me. Okay, so whenever we produce feed for our animals, that has a carbon cost associated with it. The more efficient we are at producing that feed, the less carbon we emit. And carbon models, the way that they operate, if you take fertilizers that go into the production of your feed, if you trace through the calculations, nitrogen that is fixed, okay, so nitrogen that comes in, for example, through clover, carries no carbon cost associated with it, in theory, in the model. So you have this imbalance. If you're growing your forage, your feed, whatever it may be, through the likes of high application of artificial fertilizers, you've got all this carbon hypothetically being emitted. If you're fixing that nitrogen in the form of clovers or some other sort of nitrogen fixation, you're getting a low carbon feed that's going into your animal. Okay, so we've got our carbon emissions from our feed. We then have the carbon emitted from the animals themselves. So we have methane being the big one, is the one I've just discussed. You've also got CO2 coming out there. And the other element to this, and it's a big, big component of our carbon footprint, is the slurry and farmyard manure that we produce, we store, and we then apply. At each stage, we have emissions associated with it on the way around through the circle. Okay, and if we think about our farm on the whole, we're actually also sequestering, taking carbon. Okay, so we have carbon coming in terms of trees, and also the ability of the soil to store carbon. Now, that's highly dependent on different types of soil. Sandy soils are probably emitting carbon. Very heavy soils are probably storing it. Okay, as a very sort of basic way of looking at that. Now, I'm going to focus in on really the animals as such, and the feed that we've got coming in there. Now, there are some very basic principles when it comes to carbon in these production systems, and the generic one that people may have heard of, and I got in trouble whenever I said this to the BBC, is that if you reduce your number of days to slaughter, by definition, what you tend to do is reduce everything at every step within reason. Now, that's a very generic rule, okay? And you could say the same for the dairy sector and the rest of them. As you improve the efficiency of the system, by definition, you will lower the quantity of resources that goes into making it. And certainly when you look at life cycle assessments and bioeconomic models of beef production systems, as you lower the number of days to slaughter, certainly down to around 16 or 17 months, you get a reduction in emissions. Beyond that, sometimes it works out about the same, because you tend to transition over from sort of low carbon feeds into, you know, higher carbon protein feeds, your soyas, your palm kernels, your protein tends to carry quite a high carbon cost. And what we're going to focus in here now, folks, is we're going to focus in on really the feed. I've done bodies of work, certainly in terms of manure management, manure storage, and using manures. Manures for us and agriculture, I would suggest, are a huge opportunity in terms of net zero and renewables, but that's by the by, and that's for a different conversation. But I'm going to talk mostly about feed, formulating diets to actually minimize carbon footprint. And the reality is, a lot of the time, certainly when you take sequestration out of the way, to put sequestration in perspective, we have a carbon footprint for the Harper Adams farm. It is very livestock heavy, as you've just seen. And we estimate, if we had mature trees that were readily available, taking in carbon and essentially storing it, to offset our own carbon footprint from our own farm, we would need a farm of equal size with the same area of trees, okay, just to offset the quantity of carbon that we're producing from all of those livestock systems, okay, which is not viable. That's never going to happen. It's not a thing. But you have got easy wins in terms of efficiency, and they normally tend to translate into economics as well, and I'll come into that in a little bit of a second. So just in terms of, if we're talking about nutrition of beef production systems, and my head always works in terms of growth rate. So if we talk about growing diets and finishing diets, which I'll take us into a minute, and you'll see where I'm coming from whenever I'm into formulating them. But if we think of our growing phase, you know, if we take the growth of an animal to look something like a curve, certainly whenever you're feeding ad lib or all you can eat, you grow your animal up in your curve into your carcass sort of go box, as we would call it in Ireland, at the end, into your carcass spec, you slaughter your animal, okay? So you've got your growing phase, which is your period of continuous growth, where you really want to grow that animal up, grow that animal out, being the theory, okay? I would probably argue that nowadays you probably don't need to focus too much on growing an animal up and growing an animal out. The genetics in the market seem to want a slightly smaller animal, so it should probably be to try and finish as efficiently and quickly as possible. Breed dependent, but you've then got a finishing phase, which is your short, sharp period of maximum live weight gain, where you want your fat cover and maximize your meat yield. And we tend to vary those depending on what sort of framed animal that we're looking at. So you've got your large frame, your continentals. In our case, our large framed animals are British Blue Crosses in our intensive production system. That I will stick on a finishing diet as soon as I can. There will be no growing phase whatsoever, for want of a better word. And then you have our smaller framed animals, as typified by our Angus, okay, where you want to maybe lower that lifetime live weight gain to try and develop a greater frame through to slaughter. Okay, so we've got those two principles. You've got these growing diets designed to grow your animal up, grow your animal out. And we've got these finishing diets where you really want to hammer home. Now, when we look at certainly carcass specs and why animals don't make it. A large number of them don't make it in spec because they're simply too thin, which would tell us that there's something going wrong with that finishing phase. Okay, so we're not laying down enough energy whenever we need to, or laying down enough fat as a result of energy whenever we need to. Puberty, I have puberty marked on there for the simple reason that I say to the students that before puberty, it's damn difficult to make an animal too fat. Okay, so you can really maximize growth rates in that time. Okay, and take a real advantage of that, certainly for the purposes of beef production. Now, before I hit diet formulations and carbon in a minute, what does that translate into? Well, the most important thing here, if you pick up, for example, AHDB, growing and finishing cattle for better returns, the big thing is this higher protein concentration. Protein we associate with driving that animal out, up and out. We associate protein with frame growth. Okay, I've historically done studies on elevated crude protein concentrations to try and exaggerate frame growth, and to be honest, I've never ever found very much. There seems to be a biological ceiling, which if you follow the biology kind of makes sense. So in beef cattle, we really don't, or at least I am not aware of any scientific evidence that would suggest there's advantages to oversupplying or overfeeding protein in relation to an animal's requirements. The other big thing on here is our ME, so modest ME values of 10.5 to 11.5, okay? And basically that's what's driving our growth rate or our average daily gain. You can see there 0.7 to 1.2 kilograms per day, okay? But the idea that we're not laying down too much fat. So contrast those whenever we move on to a finishing diet. Okay, our finishing diet here at the minute would be predominantly 50% on a dry matter basis. Our finishing diet currently is 50% maize, 20% raw barley, and the rest is a protein blend with growth rates of about 1.5 to 1.6 up to slaughter. And if you were to ask me where, in terms of our intensive beef finishing system, how would I want to change that? Well, I'd want to stop buying in brought in protein. I'd also want to stop feeding the maize. I'd actually rather grow a perennial ryegrass clover mixed sward where I'm getting the elevated ME concentration coming in from the perennial ryegrass and the clover. I'm offsetting my fertilizer by having nitrogen fixation from the clover. I'm driving my high growth rates, and those high growth rates are being maintained by homegrown energy and protein, as opposed to a maize-based diet where I'm supplying protein at a high carbon cost that I'm buying in. Okay, so and we will try or aim to move over to that in the next year when it comes to the intensive beef production system. When you look at the economics of that, it's also quite good in comparison. And that's, where's my finishing diet, sorry. And when we talk about finishing diets, we tend to talk about very high growth rates. Okay, so growth rates maximize our meat yield, optimize our fat cover. Crude protein tends to be lower because we're not as interested in frame growth, and our ME tends to be efficiently as high as possible. Okay, which brings me to my first point. So the first thing whenever we're formulating either growing diet for inside, now those in outdoor production systems, humor me, I'll come to outdoor certainly next week. The result of that is that whenever our first choice when it comes to how we can lower the carbon footprint of these systems tends to revolve around our choice of ingredients. Ingredients that we grow and ingredients that we buy in. Okay, so if I just throw up this next slide, for example, I've got the carbon cost of various dietary ingredients. So I've got my ingredient down here. We've got soybean meal, barley, rapeseed meal, wheat, barley, sugar beet, molasses. Okay, now if you go to GLFI, which is readily available on the internet, it's kind of a global assessment of the carbon used to produce animal feed. You will find all of these numbers and an explanation of where they come from. If you are carbon auditing and you buy in feed, in theory, that feed will be going in at a book value. Okay, depending on what carbon auditing system you use, they're all slightly different. Some of them will say that you can enter a carbon feed for whatever feed if you know what you're sourcing it from your supplier, what the carbon is associated with that feed, you can have that instead of the book value. But the basic way this works is that anything you have here, UK, so wheat and barley, this is within reason the kilograms of CO2 that it takes to produce 1 ton of our feed. Okay, so that's an average value. That's typical value. So in theory, if you think about it, if you grow your own barley or you grow your own wheat and your system is more efficient than this, by definition, you are becoming more efficient than the system would actually have you think you are if you're buying in feed, if that makes sense. So you have these products that are produced on farm, okay, wheat, barley, and then you also have purchased products. So an example would be rapeseed meal. Okay, so you can see rapeseed meal, source of protein, and you can see it's slightly higher. Generically, the rule is as you go from energy feeds to protein feeds, the carbon cost of those protein feeds is a whole lot more. So you can see as you go from barley up to rapeseed meal, you're rising from 402 to 482. And then up to soybean meal, 500 to 600 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per ton of feed. Okay. Now, what I've got here is just the life cycle assessment of producing that feed. That's that number. What they will also include almost all of the time is also this land use change factor. Okay, so this is without land use change on the left. This is with land use change on the right. Now, land use change is I heat up my chainsaw, I head out to the Brazilian rainforest, I knock the tree down and I plant my soya. Okay, that's the land use change. And the way that we calculate land use change is actually quite a lot like depreciation in farm business models. Okay, so basically the land use change associated with Argentinian soybean meal is a result of deforestation in the last 20 years. So that's your loss of above ground matter and also your loss of soil organic carbon coming in there. Okay, so this land use change effect is what drives up. So whenever people talk about the high carbon cost of soya, and I've just thrown in there like a title I picked up off the, I'll not say what newspaper it was, but just like a generic, this soya destruction, the destructive effect of soya and rainforest deforestation. And when it comes to our carbon accounting, that is taken into effect in our land use change. So it's an arbitrary value in there. The one thing I would ask you to note is that if you look at the UK, okay, 432 for wheat without land use change, 432 with. So for basically that means that it's 20 years. In the last 20 years, we haven't deforested very much. Okay, and I've always found this to be quite a benign way of targeting pollution at developing countries. So when you think about it, when we think about it, if we take our protein, for example, the first thing you've got when you formulate a diet is you've got not only the cost of it, but you then got the carbon cost of the feeds that you're using. So, for example, a massive win, certainly in beef diets, when it comes to the carbon emissions of a system, if you just change over from soya to rapeseed meal, if you're buying in soya, you change over to rapeseed meal, by definition, in terms of the carbon that you knock off, you're dropping from, well, the UK version. Now, for the UK, where it says soybean meal UK 3,600, that's taking into account the various places in the globe that we buy soybean meal from, in theory. So that's an overall representative value. So some of it might come from Brazil, some from Argentina, some from elsewhere. You can see that in Argentina, okay, if you hypothetically, if you follow this system, if you're actually buying soya in Argentina, you're buying it with another couple of tons of carbon actually added on. Okay, so
James,
so one of yep, fire away.
I've got a couple of questions. One, should the third column along there, should that be saying excluding LUC? Both say including.
Oh, sorry. You've got me whilst I was asleep. some night this week. So that would be, yes. So, and of course, because of the way it is, it will not let me adjust it because I'm presenting. Hang on a second, folks. I can understand why that is confusing. So you've got, yep, excluding land use change and then including land use change. Yep, that's the first one. What's the next one?
Well, I think Mike Powley's question, I think, is obviously what sort of values, you might be coming on to this, but what sort of values would red clover and ryegrass be within these sorts of feeds?
In terms of, now the reason I haven't put, sorry, it's better if I do that and I can see you. The reason I haven't put forages up there is for the simple reason that they are so diverse depending on what way you grow them. So what I'm intending to do is I'm intending to have a look at some best case scenarios next week when it comes to forages. So clovers, for example. Now, off the top of my head, what I can tell you is a typical perennial ryegrass will be somewhere around equivalent to just slightly below barley in terms of carbon emissions, right? Now, if you take as rough numbers that if you've got about a 30% clover sward in there, it halves your nitrogen use roughly. So in theory, if you've got a clover, a proportion of clover in there, you've potentially halved the carbon value of your perennial ryegrass clover sward off the top of my head. But you then get interactions coming in there as well. So I have a couple of those ready for next week, if that makes sense. Is everyone happy? Yep.
Okay. Another question. What's the figure for UK feed beans?
UK feed beans. I considered putting it in that table and didn't. I want to say it's around the 400s. You could look it up. You could definitely. Was it 400? No, sorry. When you say feed beans, do you mean whole cropped or do you mean?
I'll have to wait till Mike's replied.
We'll wait and see what that's. We'll wait and see what that's coming through as. But yeah, obviously, if you've got beans, you've got nitrogen fixation. But this is where you're into. Sorry to segue, but this is where you're into sort of land use arguments. So my arable colleagues get very wound up about the concept of growing beans. So if you think about, you can grow your wheat, okay, you can stick it through a distillery, you'll get a yield of approximately 5 tons of protein, and then in terms of your co-product, and then you can take your co-product and you can stick it through a beef animal. Okay, if you think about that in terms of land use from a certain area, okay, whereas, and that's perceived as bad for the environment, but you're getting human edible food and you're then getting a co-product which yields protein that you can feed to cattle. But if you take your beans, you're getting a reduced yield of beans. So whenever, this is where all these things interact and sometimes fall down. So when you talk about efficiency of land use, if you grow your wheat, you can use it for 2 uses. But if you grow your beans, you're effectively limiting yourself to a yield of a certain level of protein. And that's where, folks, in terms of the EU and their current policy going forward, and they're potentially discussing some reductions and moving towards a reduction in intensive systems. One of the hypotheses is that they will just offshore a lot of their pollution to South America, because that's where it's going to go. If they reduce their own yield of stuff, you're just going to offshore a lot of it into the South Americas by definition and create even more. So you do get trade-offs between land use and all that there sort of stuff, in theory. But yeah, sorry for that, excluding land use change. Shall I carry on, Katie?
Yep, no, that's fine. There is just one person that, Neil, if you've got a question, you'd put your hand up. If you've got a question, please type it in the box. And another question has just come in. Let me just ask this. How many kilograms of concentrate per animal are you feeding on the 2 different cattle systems and at what age?
you're asking me that off the top of the bat. FCR on the intensive system is approximately 5-1 for the whole basis on a dry matter basis, and 50% of that is 50% of that is concentrate currently. Isn't that the way it works out? 50% of that is concentrate currently. So yes, quite a bit. On the outdoor system, the plan, certainly after turnout, is to feed nothing. But yeah, I'll hang on, I'll write that, I'll add that up for next week. Kilograms of concentrate fed. It's relatively easy for me to work that out. So I shall. Happy enough, Katie? Shall I keep going?
Yeah, no, that's great. So David, he'll have the answer ready for you next week. We're not quite Blue Peter to have it ready now.
Yeah. I'll have that one for you next week. So well for that one. Right, so well, excuse my faux pas for excluding land use change and including. It turns out I can't spell. But you've got the first element coming in here as to what ingredients that you have got. So we've got our ingredients, we've got them, we can make them into a diet. Now, one big advantage of intensive production systems, we've got two both running. One big advantage of intensive production systems is that you've got a reduced days to slaughter. Okay. Now, looking at the system as a whole, you can grow a low carbon feed to introduce into the system, but the bit where it kind of falls down is the manure management aspect, because whether you like it or not, and my colleague that works in pigs gets infuriated with this, a large proportion of the carbon that comes from animal systems is actually in our manure and our manure storage. So if you look at the outdoor system, one of the advantages that it has is that the direct application of manures to the ground does not come with a carbon storage value because you're not storing it. Okay. So one of the advantages of the outdoor system is that you can minimize your carbon associated with the storage of your manures. So in theory, if you have a low carbon feed going in, if you're maintaining a very high level of performance and you're minimizing the emissions associated with manure storage, in theory, you can get it quite low. Okay. Now, there is a big caveat to that, and I'll come to it in a second, which is, right, so before we had two, the system that we currently have is we have two beef production systems. If we need to do research, we modify them slightly, and we have an indoor and we have an outdoor system, and we can use those for different grant proposals, different things, different teaching, final year projects, all that sort of stuff. Historically, what we used to do at Harper's, we used to just vary our beef production system on whatever grant we had at that point in time. Okay. Now, what that meant, we carried out a large body of research over a long number of years to look at alternative finishing diets. Alternatives to cereals, specifically our whole crop wheats, our red clovers. So your whole crop wheat as a source of energy, alternative to your cereals, red clover as an alternative to the proteins, your soyas, your rapeseed meals, and to try and look at those alternative forages in comparison to our cereals. We also looked at increased protein concentrations and the effect of frame growth. So what we've essentially got is we've got a very large database of all these different diets, okay, and the performance of those animals associated with those diets. So the general thinking is, hang on a minute, if we look back, we can actually formulate what is essentially the optimal diet for those animals and hypothesize what effect that might actually have on our carbon footprint. In academia, it's called precision feeding, which I find quite funny. for the simple reason that when you talk about precision, you imagine computers, laptops, and everything else. Certainly, this would be, in my idea, precision in terms of a sledgehammer. We're not doing so. Whenever we carried out this process and we reformulated our diets, all we basically did is look back and see, well, protein is the place to start. If we want to formulate a diet that is A, less expensive, B, carries a lower carbon cost, and C, actually increases our nitrogen use efficiency, because when you feed protein, biologically, when you overfeed protein to a farm animal, it's not used. It's efficiency of use for other processes, for example, lactation in a dairy cow, or growth in our sheep, our pigs, whatever it may be, our beef cattle, is actually incredibly poor. Okay, now there's lots of caveats to that, but most of the time it's incredibly poor. If you want performance, you want to feed energy as energy. You don't want to feed. Soya will come with an energy value, but that energy value isn't realistic. Okay, because of the way, and it's because of the way we've designed our diet formulation systems. They double account for a lot of things. So when you overfeed protein, generally you're affecting your wallet, you're affecting your carbon emissions, and you're also polluting in terms of nitrogen release from the animal. So what we were essentially doing is we were looking back, and protein is the one that we heavily focused in on. Okay. Protein is the one that we heavily focused in on. We could also focus in on vitamins and minerals. And what we really wanted to do is maximize the efficiency of those animals. So in terms of our historic performance, we had these crossbred Aberdeen Angus that we had used to try and manipulate frame growth. So we had growing diets relating to those. We had British Blue crosses, and we had fed them on whole crop wheat diets, red clover based diets, etc. And what we tried to do is essentially work out, if we hypothetically knew how much those animals ate, which we did because we were doing efficiency of these animals, we knew how quickly they growed, we knew the dietary recommendations, which are easy enough. We haven't moved on much in the beef sector. We're still using AFRC 1993, which is that little book. Okay. I was born the same year that was put together. We are able to manipulate those diets to try and end up with the optimal diet that we can have. Okay. So when it comes to these tables, what you're really interested in is A, what did we feed? Some of you will be interested in terms of how the animals performed. But more than that, how could we lower protein of those diets? Because whenever we were putting these together, we formulated crude protein. So a growing diet, 14, 16 in areas of Ireland, 18% I'm used to. Okay. And our finishing diet, which could be 12 to 14%. So what we did is we looked back at those diets. So under scenario A, that's where we formulated to crude protein. So when you're looking at these diets, we formulated to crude protein, scenario B. Under scenario B, we looked back at those diets. Okay, we had the performance of our animals, which on a farm is not that difficult to do. How much have you fed them? How quickly have they grown? Weigh the animal. If you've got any sort of diet feeder or have any sort of representation of how much feed actually goes in. And then we worked out how much protein we would need. Now, we didn't use crude protein. We used metabolizable protein supply, okay, which if I was to describe metabolizable protein, is the protein that comes from the animal's rumen, as well as the protein that comes from the rest of the digestive tract. So you've got those rumen bugs that are digesting grass, they're digesting fiber, they're creating protein that can be used for the animal. Okay, so that is a much more accurate way, metabolizable protein is a much more accurate way of determining the protein requirements of an animal. Okay, now to put that in perspective, scenario A is kind of like your nutritionist rocking up on farm. They predict the live weight of the animal, how quickly it grows and how much it eats. When you see recorded performance, that's how our animals actually performed whenever we fed this diet. Okay, and then you have scenario B, where we've reformulated to metabolizable protein. Okay, so bear in mind when you're looking at this, we've got a diet, we've got the performance of those animals, we've then reformulated to metabolizable protein, which is actually the official feeding system, the protein feeding system for the UK. Now, a large number of nutritionists may not use it, but it is actually the official protein system for the United Kingdom. Okay, so let's look at our diets. Okay, so we had a finishing study. We fed a concentrate-based diet. Very typical concentrate. We've got 70% rolled barley on a dry matter basis, sugar beet pulp, rapeseed meal, wheat distillers, molasses, minerals, and vitamins. Okay, typical concentrate-based diet, very high level of performance, finished relatively quickly. We've then got a whole crop wheat-based diet. So we're substituting, if you think about it, we're really substituting our rolled barley for our whole crop wheat silage coming in here. So this is forage-based diet, whole crop wheat, 63% whole crop wheat, a little bit of rolled barley, sugar beet pulp, rapeseed meal, wheat distillers, molasses. Okay, so how did those animals, so what did that come out as? Now, remember me saying we formulated to crude protein. You can see that both diets, both finishing diets, relatively high, it has to be said, in crude protein, but 14% crude protein coming in there. Okay, ME of 12.8 for our concentrate, ME of 12.8 for our concentrate, 10.8 for our whole crop wheat. Okay, so relatively high protein in our finishing diet there, but something that you would typically find on farm. Also, if you're buying an off-the-shelf concentrate, by definition, it will probably be higher in crude protein. So you can find that whenever you mix it with something like a grass silage, you've got an artificially very high level of protein. Okay. Now, how did our animals perform? So in these studies, remember, these were finishing studies. They started about 458 kilograms, finishing about 650. Average daily gain, you can see in terms of what we actually found for our concentrate-fed animals, they slightly underperformed in relation to how nutritional software would predict they perform. FCR 5.8, 6.4. Okay, and you can see the same for our whole crop wheat here, finishing at the same level, taking slightly longer to finish, about 1.4 kilograms per day. Okay. Now, protein. So whenever we look back at these diets, the way the MP system works is the animal has a requirement and you then give it a dietary supply. So here we have the predicted metabolizable protein required across our top row. Okay, so you can see to grow at those rates, so about 1.6 or 1.5 kilos for our concentrate fed cattle, we need about 600 grams of metabolizable protein a day. Whereas for whole crop wheat, they're growing slightly slower, so we need 570, 572. Now we predict the MP supply of the diet, or we don't predict it, excuse me, we recorded it, so we know that when we formulated a diet to 14% crude protein, we had much more metabolizable protein supplied than we actually required. Okay, now to express it as a percent, for our concentrate-fed cattle, we were supplying, 142% of what they actually required. So you think about that, it's costing me money because it's protein, it's a high-cost feed. It's also costing me in terms of carbon, and it's also more polluting in terms of nitrogen supply at the other end. So you've got the sort of the Holy Trinity coming through there in terms of what we've got as a result of oversupplying that. Now, bear in mind, scenario B I've got here, we then took that protein out, okay? Now, you can see that for our concentrate-fed diet, it's pretty bad. You've got 140% oversupply. For our whole crop wheat-based diet, because it's a forage-based diet and they eat more, you can see you've got 166%. So we're supplying protein to that animal at 166% of their requirements. Okay, this astronomically high level of crude protein. And it probably stands that we do, as a generic rule, overfeed protein in beef production systems. Dairy is slightly different, where you have a huge protein draw in terms of milk that comes from an animal, but we hugely oversupply protein in beef production systems. And it probably costs us quite a large proportion of money as well as carbon associated in there. And you can see I've put in some values for the diet costs, and you can see the drop in terms of pounds per ton of dry matter for the respective total diet whenever you're dropping from one to the other. I've then got your diet cost in terms of pound per kilogram of average daily gain, and you can see the difference that you've got across there. I happen to spec these whenever concentrate prices were at an all-time high, happened to be the few times months I picked, so you can see just how high they are there. Okay, so you've got this. Now, when we then change to metabolizable protein and we formulate what's effectively a lower protein diet, you can see that we hit a theoretical minimum. So in other words, we're limited by how many protein feeds we can take out, because theoretically we have to put something else in. So you take your protein feeds out, which in this case was rapeseed meal, was our primary source of protein. We take out our distiller's grains, which is another supply of protein, and substitute it for barley. So in theory, we've maintained the same level of performance within reason, okay? But we've made that diet much more efficient. Okay, so we've got a low protein diet, we've made it more efficient. Now, what does that do in terms of carbon? So if you look at my emissions intensity down the bottom here, folks, you can see that as I go from that high protein diet to that low protein diet, I knock quite a large quantity of carbon off the cost of my feed. Okay, so you're dropping from 3.1 kilograms per kilogram of average daily gain down to 2.9. For my whole crop wheat diet, it is very pronounced. So you can see for the carbon cost of my feed, I'm dropping from 3.66 down to 3. Okay, so I've got kind of 20-something% loss between there and there. Okay, and that's reflected also through in my total. So you can see that by formulating to metabolizable protein supply, by trying to fine-tune that, we can try and cut back on some of the use of what we would call high-cost feeds, also high carbon emissions associated feeds in there as well. And you can also see that they're, by definition, they're also cheaper. Okay. Now, what did we actually change? So if I throw up the revised diet, you can see that my concentrate came down from a crude protein concentration of 14% down to 11%. And even then, we're still predicting that it's oversupplying protein. Okay, that's probably a theoretical minimum, because all I can really do is take out my rapeseed meal and my wheat distillers and replace it with rolled barley in this example. For my whole crop wheat, you can see I've dropped from 14% crude protein down to 10% crude protein, again with the removal of my rapeseed meal and my wheat distillers, okay, and replacing that with barley. Now, what I should also say here is you will notice that the carbon associated with my concentrate production system is a lot lower than my whole crop wheat. That is an arbitrary value. When you feed concentrate-based diets, one of the hypothetical assumptions in most carbon emissions models is that less methane is produced, okay? And it's by a factor of half. So if you're feeding a majority concentrate-based diet, most systems will divide your enteric emissions or your methane emissions by 2. Okay. Now, in reality, across a whole variety of different types, you will have quite a large spread of how much methane is produced, but these are very blunt tools, and that's the sort of way that they act sometimes. Okay, so that's when people talk about concentrate-based diets and being lower emitting, that's what they mean. You have less methane in the way that it is calculated. So that's the two diets that we ended up with when we look back and we formulate to metabolizable protein supply. Ultimate question, we don't know. We assume the average daily gain would have been maintained. Low protein diets and beef cattle are kind of an understudied topic area. My basic thinking when it comes to the biology is that if you were to lower the protein content of diets, the animal would actually eat slightly more. So by definition, you would drive your growth rate even higher. If you look at intake equations for dairy cattle, and that's when we look at low protein diets for dairy cattle, that seems to be the way that it works. Certainly whenever you get down to around requirements. The other hypothesis would be, if you look at some feed intake equations that are out there, as you increase protein content, you increase intake. So the great unknown is that although we're hypothesizing a constant average daily gain in this scenario, we can't say for certain. Okay. But in terms of messages that I would have, an easy win when it comes to diet formulation is just the ingredients that you're using. Soya swapped with rapeseed certainly is an easy substitution. The amino acid profile of rapeseed is not as good as soya, but if you look at the dairy industry, that may be a problem. We have substituted soya out of all diets, with the exception of the pigs and poultry here at Harper, and even our high lactation cows don't seem to have an issue with rapeseed meal. Certainly for beef cattle, the amino acid profile of rapeseed meal should not be a problem. And the other thing is to consider lowering the protein concentration of diets. And I would actually take that slightly further into saying the more that you can produce at home, certainly through nitrogen fixation, and the more efficiently that you can use it, certainly the better, as opposed to buying it from somewhere else at a high carbon value. And I've nattered on for way too long. That's probably the conclusion.
Thank you, James. We've got a few questions. I didn't want to interrupt you when you were in full flow then. So one from Robert. When you move, from soya to rapeseed, does your carbon emissions get adjusted to account for the slower growth rate? Do you know?
You shouldn't be. As long as your diet is isoenergetic, you should have isoenergetic and protein is still meeting requirements. You should have the same growth rate. There shouldn't be any effect of that in the system. And that's what I get our students to play around with. I have miniature little emissions models, and I get them to play around with lots of different diets in hypothetical scenarios. So you shouldn't have any compromisation in growth rate as long as you're meeting protein requirements. People tend to think of feeds as having, certain properties. To me, a feed is just an energy or a protein supply. It's a number, and that's the way. If you lift a textbook, that's the way it's presented. So you have the requirements of the animal, you have the supply of the feed, and as long as the supply is meeting requirements, it should be fine. So you should have no difference in growth rate, but your difference in carbon cost of soya and rapeseed is so different in these systems that you could actually account for a massive difference in growth rate and still be okay.
Okay. If the feed supplier purchases soya through a responsible soya scheme, which includes deforestation, the carbon value should come down?
Yes. This is where lots of systems. Now, carbon calculators are very diverse, and I know of a benchmarking firm that works in the US that tried quite a large number of, put the same farm through a large number of carbon calculators and got a difference of 30% between the highest emitting number and the lowest emitting number. These are very blunt tools. And of course, the farmer at the time turned around and said, well, I'll just use the high emitting one now, and in 5 years' time, use the low emitting one. So they've cut their emissions by 20% by just using a different carbon model. So yeah, they are very blunt tools. So yeah, what was the question again? I've got lost in my own talking.
I think it's about if the feed supply uses responsible soya, does that lower their carbon?
Oh yes. So if you have, most of these systems will work on book values. GLFI database that I've got there is a book value. So in theory, if you're buying responsibly sourced feed and you enter that, that will lower your carbon footprint. So for example, the carbon footprint of our pig unit, whenever we moved away from using book values to what the processor or feed compounder certified value was, our feed carbon footprint halved for our pig unit. So there's an example. If you've got a value, and you've also got an interaction there with homegrown. So if you're producing feed at home more efficiently than those numbers, you're winning, obviously, as well. But the counter way of looking at that is if you're producing feed at home inefficiently, you're also losing out.
Okay, thank you. If you could possibly share, James, at some point, your paper in the chat. There's some people that would be quite interested in reading your paper that you briefly put up there.
Oh yeah, I'll stick that up.
Thank you. Another chap is feeding silage with a protein of 16.8 and an ME of 11.5. What should he be feeding in terms of concentrates? I guess how, you know, I guess
that was
large list.
This is the thing you get into with, this is why I like grass silages mixed with clover, because you can cut them at a relatively high ME and they are in essence a totally complete feed, if that makes sense. So when I look at models through our intensive beef production system, you know, the farm came to me and went, what do you want? Well, in reality, I want 500 tons of grass silage grown with red clover, low nitrogen input, ME of 11.5 or greater, 11.9. You've tested at 12.1. I would ideally have that. But remember, we're in competition with the dairy unit for stuff. And a protein content that meets the animal's requirements. So at 16% crude protein, that's going to meet the requirements of even a relatively young dairy cross animal that has a high protein requirement. Now, one of the great things is that you can then mix a little, you could feed that straight in an intensive beef production system with minerals in there and they'll perform fantastically well. What I would probably do is throw in a little bit of barley, because that barley will actually free up more MP in your system, give you a little bit more intake and give you quite high returns for the quantity that you put in there. So our ideal system is actually quite similar to that. If we had a grass silage like that, we would be feeding it with just a little bit of barley. We may even be feeding it straight as a complete diet with just the minerals added in there. The other option that we might do is, because we grow quite a lot of maize, is we might actually tailor the protein in our forages. So all we'll do is, whenever we have a young animal whose protein requirements are quite high, feed them mostly a grass silage. As we get up to about 400 kilograms, I can feed it almost straight maize, which then gives me more grass silage to pump into our dairy cows or to pump into our younger animals. So I can just adjust the ratio of maize to grass silage to tailor the protein the whole way through the production curve and get as high a level of efficiency from forage as possible. Sorry, that's a long-winded answer to a short question.
Okay. Thank you. Someone said, what about adding urea to the whole crop wheat diet to kick off the rumen performance and therefore higher rumen produced protein?
Again, you could do that, but that would you could do that. But again, all you're doing is oversupplying protein. You know, if I wanted, for those diets, if protein is already in oversupply, the limiting factor is energy. Urea carries no energy value whatsoever. It carries only a protein value, a rumen degradable protein value. So you don't get increases in performance per se as a result of feeding urea in protein excessive diets. It would be more, how do I get more energy in there and how do I get more intake would be my big one. Protein tends not to be limiting. It tends to be energy and intake. How do I get them to eat more? And because as you drive higher intakes, if you think about it, every day you keep an animal alive, you pay to keep that animal alive. So when you drive very high performance as a result of them eating a lot, by definition, you're diluting that maintenance cost. So again, it would be anything that drives higher intakes and anything that drives higher energy intake as well in there.
Okay, thank you. How do the two systems compare in financial terms?
You're into theory. I came upon outdoor production systems. We have a few. Our soil type, it has to be said here, is incredibly light, and we have surrounding us beef production systems that are all outdoor. Suckler beef production systems that are all outdoor. I once attended a New Zealand sort of based seminar where they spoke about in New Zealand, whenever they talk about costs of production, the easiest thing is stick them outside for their entire lifetime and maintain a mediocre growth rate, which kind of got me thinking. And they were talking about costs of production that they supposedly had converted across to UK numbers that were, I mean, if you look up AHDB, hypothetically, they produce beef for, I think it's about, is it 5 times less? I would need to go back and look. But they're talking about beef production systems that are sort of 1.1 kilograms per day lifetime gain, still slaughtering 14, 15, 16 months, no concentrate use, and the principle is that whenever you, one of the big losses in beef production systems is whenever you go outside to inside or inside to outside, you transition the rumen over. So it takes the rumen roughly about 3 weeks to transition from an indoor diet to an outdoor diet. When it comes to physical structure, you're talking more like 6 weeks. Now, anyone on the call that's probably tracked cattle at turnout, they lose a very large proportion of growth rate in that time. So the advantage of an all outdoor system is that you can maintain that growth rate in those months that you would otherwise lose it at turnout or at turnout in the spring or during housing in the autumn, with the idea that you get to a slaughter weight relatively soon in the production cycle. The numbers that have been quoted at me are 30p per day all in for the outdoor production system. Our indoor one, regardless of how inexpensive I make the feed, I cannot get anywhere near that. Okay, so we have chosen to have an outdoor production system. We're about 4 months in, and I'll probably be able to tell you what it's like a year and a half from now in terms of a direct comparison.
Okay, thank you. These guys are offering hay to cattle on a high clover and chicory lay this week. The hay is not reducing the amount of grass they are eating per day, so dry matter intake has increased. May we assume that the fibre in the hay is helping the rumen and slowing down the passage of protein?
Sorry, Katie, I've been reading questions on the thing and not listening to you. Go again.
They're offering hay to cattle on a high clover and chicory lay this week, and the hay is not reducing the amount of grass they're eating. So they're assuming that the fibre in the hay is helping the rumen and slowing the passage of protein?
It's hard to tell that without more specifics on that one. Is that one in the chat?
Yeah.
I'll have a look at that one for next week. High clover / chicory lay, not reducing the amount of grass they are eating per day. Fiber in the diet is helping rumen and slowing down passage of protein too. May we assume the fiber? Well, yeah, I mean, the more fiber that you put in the diet, the more you increase rumen retention time, the more metabolizable protein that you make available. But if you're feeding a clover chicory lay, I'd assume that protein is so well in excess, it would be, if you were to actually sit down and work it out, it would be massively in excess anyway. In that sort of system, I'd assume it's ME that's limiting, would be my answer to that one.
Okay, thank you.
But that doesn't mean that the protein in those feeds is not driving a higher intake as such.
Okay. Another one saying, glad someone's talking about low protein diets, because that's what they're doing and they're getting some really good results there. What's your opinion on the use of fodder beet in growing and finishing rations?
Sorry, I should have been more specific. Fodder beet's brilliant. One of the things on my to-do list now, fodder beet is brilliant in terms of nutrition. This is where you come into in terms of systems. In terms of growing it, sustainability would be atrocious. But in terms of and soil erosion and all that sort of stuff. But in terms of nutrition, it's a nutritionist's dream. In indoor systems, it's a cheap supply of energy. If you were to give me the ideal outdoor system for the winter period, I would be growing fodder beet. And the important aspect there is that the high water content of the fodder beet would drive intake. Sorry, I think I'm getting shouted at by either security or students through a window. The high water content would drive intake. Fodder beet's a bit of a strange thing when it comes to nutrition, because the bulb is effectively your energy source and the plant material up above is effectively your protein supply plus your trace element supply when it comes to your animal. So if you were to give me my ideal outwintering crop outside, it would be fodder beet, but the agronomy of it would be as such to provide a good bulb, but also dense green matter on the top, because that's my protein supply. So whenever you've got an outwintering system grazing fodder beet, you've got your plant material, which you're grazing behind your electric fence. That's your supply of protein. Your energy is then coming from your bulb slightly behind it. And then you've got some source of fiber at 7 to 10%, hypothetically, dry matter intake coming from whatever it be, round bale of forage, deferred grazing, hay, whatever it is. And that would be, in terms of outdoor performance, nutritionally, that would be the optimal thing that I would be feeding. And that's what New Zealanders would currently feed. Sustainability issues with fodder beet are, of course, the growing it, the soil erosion bit of it, the bare land bit of it. So one of the things on my to-do list would be, you can potentially direct drill it now. And you've also got then the capacity of cultivating it in strips and things like that as well. So you've got a section of fodder beet, section of grass. So you've got your fodder beet fiber. You're essentially formulating a diet outdoors to maximize your level of performance. Now, when you feed it inside, because you haven't got your green material, you're not getting the benefit of the low-cost protein in there, but you are getting the benefit of the low-cost energy. So that would be my take on fodder beet. At the minute, we will be using kale for the simple reason that you don't have all the sustainability issues associated with it. B, we currently use it for our replacement heifers. So we'll probably start with that one and work our way outwards from there. So yeah, fodder beet I would have as a very, very valuable feed for beef cattle. I've just picked up in the chat that somebody wasn't talking about the comparison of the indoor and the outdoor system. They were talking about concentrate and alternative forages. If you look back at concentrate prices over the last couple of years and you are feeding an alternative forage, whether it be, if you go to HDB website, we've actually got the break-even prices for those different forages in the market in terms of performance and when it would be useful to grow it instead of cereals. If you look at the last couple of years and you look at alternative forage diets, certainly with the catastrophic rise in barley prices, it was very advantageous to be feeding any of those forages in comparison. So red clover, whole crop wheat, I would probably have my top one as grass silage, as I say, as a grass silage sort of clover mix. Sorry, Katie, you're muted.
Sorry. You're trying to phase out maize, but it has a low N requirement and it has a good insurance in a dry year, as well as loads of starch. What's the problem?
What's the problem with maize? The problem with maize, there is no problem with maize actually. If I was to feed, well, again, we're back to sustainability issues with maize. It's quite entertaining. I once did an interview. I don't like talking to people. I once did an interview and I spoke about maize, and I got hate mail about how bad maize was for the environment. But the interview had been clipped where I hadn't actually got to the end of my sentence. Maize comes with lots of environmental consequences. We talk about soil erosion, all that there sort of stuff. We've played around with undersowing it and direct drilling it. Now, nutritionally, maize is actually a very low carbon feed to produce. If you look at any book values for maize, you'll see it's actually quite low. My problem with maize is that in growing cattle, so I'm talking 80 kilograms up to probably 300 kilograms, I need quite a bit of protein to supply to that young dairy cross animal. It's not a problem in suckler production systems, because you think about it, your cow's producing all the protein for your calf up to that age, so that's not an issue. Suckler cows are brilliant. They have this great capacity to turn what's essentially crap into high-level protein within a production system. But that's the problem I have, is that my tendency, you can easily formulate a very high-performance finishing diet based solely on maize and not much else. But when it comes to driving performance in those younger animals, you need a little bit more protein to do it. And if you're using that in our case, bought-in rapeseed meal, that is effectively 15 to 20% of the diet that I will always have to buy that I can never produce at home. In our case, for example. So again, I have no issue. I would consider maize to be a brilliant feed to feed, and no issue feeding it. Certainly above 300 kilograms, you don't need to add much, if anything, to very good maize. But for those growing animals, that little bit of protein. But bear in mind that, you know, these are put together in 1993. Feed into beef is out there. When it'll come into being, I don't know. But our understanding of younger calves, particularly from the dairy industry, is particularly atrocious. And by that, I can give you a typical example. Our calves transition up here. They're supposed to go on a 14 to 16% crude protein diet and remain on that up to about 250, 300 kilograms. Then that protein should get dropped. One of the technicians took the initiative at one point in time. We were feeding pellets to 80 to 90 kilogram calves that had just come out of the calf rearing unit. And they had put in some of the finishing diet at, what would it be, about 13% crude protein into these 80 to 90 kilogram calves. And they stopped eating the pelleted concentrate, started eating the maize finishing diet, and so she just took the concentrate away. And if you read that book, hypothetically, those animals should not be able to thrive, let alone grow well, on that sort of diet, and they were doing over 2 kilograms a day. So our understanding of protein supply to young animals is particularly poor. Our systems are very, very poor at predicting it. And it's also highly variable depending on how those calves have been reared. I would also put that caveat in there as well.
Okay, thank you. There's obviously cattle generally are at the bottom of the pyramid when they're choosing the grains, because the better quality grains go into brewing, milling, etc. And is that taken into consideration by the calculators? Probably not, but I would need to check that out. I know if you feed in byproducts, that is taken into consideration, but I'd need to check that out, Paul, and ask someone about that one. Have you got anything to add to that, James?
When you say byproducts taken into account, Katie, what do you mean?
If someone's I know some of the suggestions from Jude on people's reports are to feed byproducts rather than so waste feed products, I think, because obviously that has got lower emissions on them.
Depends on the value that you attribute to it. One of the big issues that I mean, soya, for example, for goodness sake, soya is used for human food. It's a blinking byproduct. One of the issues I have with byproducts, and I have this issue with carbon calculation in general, byproducts, co-products, whatever way you want to call them, whatever way you want to define them, to me, if you have taken a grain into a distillery to produce whatever it would be, that carbon cost of that feed should go to the human food that comes out of it, whether it be whiskey, whatever it may be. But sometimes that is not the case. Sometimes the way that it is attributed is they will attribute carbon based on the economic value of the byproduct or the co-product. So if you think about it, you've taken this feed stuff, you've taken it through a very energy intensive process, it's come out the other end, and because it carries an economic value, they slap a proportion of the overall carbon on it. So you have this really strange scenario in some cases where wheat, for example, may go for a process and come out as a byproduct, co-product, whatever you want to call it, with more carbon than it actually went in. So to me, that is human edible feed that a beef animal is taking and turning into human edible feed. So it should carry no carbon cost because we're dealing with somebody else's waste effectively. But that's not quite how it works. Quite a lot of the time we are carrying somebody else's carbon emissions wrongfully, but it depends what way it's calculated.
Great. Right, I think the final question on here this evening, again, would a mostly maize-based diet, would some urea be useful in that?
Yeah, maize will be deficient in protein. Maize, I mean, I'd struggle to see anyone testing above about 10% crude protein for maize, so by definition it should be pretty deficient. Maize is an interesting one because if you take finishing cattle, it's probably the only feedstuff that you could use to get somewhere close to their requirements. And so I would be interested from the maize point of view in actually testing out whenever you feed slightly below requirements, as we can do in dairy cows. We've managed it in dairy cows and had increased performance. What actually happens then, and in the beef world is almost totally not understood. But yes, urea in that example would by definition supply you more MP that would be definitely used in some way, shape, form, or description.
Okay, thank you. One more question's just quickly came in. Do you always feed mineral supplements?
Yes, for want of a better word. As someone who did their PhD and their early research career in minerals, yes, always a mineral supplement. I will change mineral supplements quite religiously. In other words, if I'm feeding very intensive diets, I will worry about urinary calculi. So I will go for specific beef spec minerals for those ones. In outdoor production systems, you're then into lots of minerals potentially becoming limiting copper being an example, specifically in outdoor wintering systems. Certainly a lot of our heifers that we take off keel systems at Harper tend to be slightly deficient in copper. You also then have issues with selenium in there as well. So in our outdoor system, we will be bolusing some mineral boluses to supply those certain minerals over certainly the summer as well, because we've sampled our grass and it's slightly low, and definitely during the wintering period as well.
Do you have a Pacific bolus made up for those, James?
No, we'll just be taking an off the shelf. Any of the big companies, a 6-month supply off the shelf, and it'll go, and that'll be it. We'll probably go for the combination mix because we find that we need copper. Copper is a strange mineral. It's quite hard to make animals toxic in a lot of minerals, with the exception of intensive beef diets and copper. We find our beef diets to be, we find our forages to be relatively low in copper, so we will supply with copper. Copper is kind of a regional thing. You're either too much of it or too little of it. So we will supply with copper as a combined bolus in there. So selenium, cobalt, iodine will all go in as one batch. The only thing I would worry about with most of those other elements, you're not going to do any harm if you give a little too much, because it's quite hard to get to toxicity. So copper would be the only thing I'd worry about taking out. And if I was in a very copper excess region, I would take the copper out of it.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, James, for sharing your expertise with us this evening. As I say, we are back again next week for feed production and utilisation within beef production systems. So if you haven't already said you wanted to join us next week, then do let me know, and I'll send those links out nearer the time so that they don't get lost in your inbox. And if there's anything else you do definitely want to hear about for us to include next week, just type it in the chat and I can pass that on to James to try and make sure we include it next week. But thank you very much, everyone, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.
Cheers, folks.
Thanks, guys.